Leading anything is hard, especially when the mission is deeply challenging and the resources are scarce. Welcome to the Elevate podcast, where we have meaningful conversations with leaders about growing healthy organizations. Your host is Neil Hart, and this podcast is brought to you by the Mergon Foundation, a resource partner to ministries who expand God's kingdom and bring hope and restoration to communities across Africa and the Middle East.
It's great to be with you today for our next episode of Elevate. Have you ever wondered what it takes to lead multicultural environments? Today I'm with Edwin Fillies, who co-founded the Nations to Nations ministry in YWAM. He's going to be speaking to us about leading multicultural environments. Edwin, for all his unassuming personality traits, is part of a small circle of international leaders of YWAM. YWAM operates on almost every country in the world and trains in excess of 25,000 people per year. That's quite a feat. And it requires a rare set of skills to lead a multicultural environment like this. Edwin lives in Muizenberg, South Africa. And Edwin, it's so good to be with you today.
It's so good to be with you, Neil, and I'm looking forward to us chatting around this important topic.
And Edwin, tell us a little bit about your story. So you came from fairly hidden circumstances in South Africa, and you've lived all around the world in different places. And tell us about that. Tell us about some of the countries you've traveled and about your family.
Yeah, I grew up in a very rural part outside of Mossel Bay, South Africa. And, I'm the youngest of 10 kids, the smallest. So everything in my life was small village, small house, small bed, small dog, small cat. But with a vision just to travel to the next door town. That was Mossel Bay, of course, 20 kilometers away. That is how big my vision was. It wasn't even to cross a border of state or province or county. That was my world. And so of course it was encountering Jesus at the age of 17 that his vision became my vision. And his vision is the world. His vision is for everyone to hear the good news. And so it was never for me about traveling, but it was for me about following the call of God upon my life. And that led me to meet my wife in Nairobi, Kenya. So we met there, got engaged while I was living in England, and we got married in Switzerland. And then we've traveled, to many countries as a couple and as a family. I told my wife I said, I can't offer you richness, can't offer you the Swiss holiday chalet in the Alps, but I can offer you an adventure as we follow Jesus. And the first 18 months of our marriage, we've traveled together to 18 different countries.
That's quite a honeymoon. And Edwin, tell us about the countries you've lived in. You've lived in a couple of different countries, is that right?
Of course, growing up in South Africa, I spent some time in South America where I did my leadership training school. So that was quite an immersion in the Latin culture. And then I moved from South Africa back in 94, end of 93, moved to England, just north of London, lived there for 3 years, and then moved to Switzerland after we got married, lived there for 2 years and studied French. And then we moved back to South Africa and moved back to Switzerland. As a family, we spent some time 3.5 months in the Philippines, leading another leadership training program for our Asian leaders. So I remember the younger kids, they, after 3.5 months, we took them for a treat to McDonald's, and they ordered a McDonald's rice burger. So that is how, embedded they were in the culture after that time, growing up just eating rice.
And I mean, there may be some listeners who are wondering why the topic of cross-cultural or multicultural leadership is important. Tell us what God's heart is for the nations and why this matters to us.
Really what sums it up, Neil, is, when you read Revelation chapter 7, 9. That is what history is moving towards. That's really where we are heading. It all started in a garden in Genesis, but it's finishing in a city called the New Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And that's where John saw a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, every tribe, every people, every language. And so, this is really throughout the biblical narrative, God's heart has always been for the every and for the all. Jesus giving the Great Commission, preaching the gospel to every creature.
Yeah.
Matthew chapter 28, disciple all nations. And then this beautiful picture in Revelation. And so I think as leaders, we have to cultivate that heart that is open for the other. I think one of the important principles that we overlook for leadership in the body of Christ that comes up both in the list of Titus and Timothy for eldership, leadership in the church, is a leader needs to be hospitable. And that word hospitable, it actually means xenophilios in the Greek.
Okay.
It actually means loving the foreigner, loving the stranger, loving what is different, loving what is other. And so I think even as the world is becoming more global, and we can be caught by this globalization and think, oh, but there's a youth culture, everybody's, speak the same, they look the same, they dress the same, listen to the same music. But even as the world becomes more global, the world is also becoming more tribal. Yeah. And so I think that's sometimes where we miss it. Yes, globalization, it's the entry door, but there are other doors as well. And I think that's why it's so important for us that we understand, how important it is when it comes to people's identity, that is linked to their ethno-linguistic roots. And so I think for us to lead in this kind of environment as leaders is very critical.
But Edwin, what makes it so difficult for people to work with people from different cultures? I mean, why is it so hard for me to work with someone from another culture?
For one, it is, just difficult, Neil, to work with others. Yeah. I think there's just an inherent thing that we actually, we want others to become like us. There is just this, I think that maybe is part of the fall, and we are being redeemed, day by day. But I think it's just something natural, that, even if you're from the same culture, there are just certain challenges which I call, I've got preferences, I'm selfish, but then those things get amplified, especially cross-culturally, those inherent things that create those obstacles to effective relationships. People are never supposed to be objects to be used. I think I see that with the Lord Jesus. People were never a means to an end. They would end in themselves. That's why I said, I don't call you servants, I call you friends. Okay. The whole relational dynamic, I think it is just so important. And that's why I always say that people are mysteries to be explored instead of problems to be solved. Because it's so easy to look at the other and think, they are problematic. They are problems. And I think it's not so much problems, but I do think it's really when we open our hearts that we become, our potential is being unlocked. The more we relate to people that are so different from us.
Edwin, you also lead with other leaders, and I'm sure everyone in YWAM leadership circles are not, one is not as good as another one is cross-culturally. And I'm not asking you to comment on YWAM, but what are the things you see with other leaders when there's cross-cultural leadership? What are the differences that you experience with different leaders in these environments?
So I think for me it is, it's the mutuality that I think is very important, and that has been one of the strengths I've seen in particularly YWAM, is that we go into a country like Nepal, and hardly any Christians about 25 years ago. But we believe that Nepalis can be, not only becoming Christians that we need to reach out to, but they can actually become leaders. They can actually become missionaries. And that is why we've developed these multicultural leadership teams. So, of course, a big challenge is always, when you deal with, those coming from individualistic cultures and, working with cultures that very much think in terms of, community, cultures that are sharing. And, and that creates, quite a bit of friction and tension. And so, of course, we can move from one extreme to the other extreme. There is the individuality part that God honors, because that help us with initiative. But then at the same time, there is this whole thing of family, the whole thing of the strength of the community. And so I think it's not one or the other. But what is important, that what brings us together is this whole aspect of relationship and a common vision, because I think it's around a common vision and with relationship that we can work effectively together.
Edwin, you spoke earlier about individualistic cultures and collective cultures, and one of the things that seems to help us tremendously is understanding the kind of cultural backgrounds as well as the worldviews that we come from. And so individualism is really a worldview in the West, and collectivism is a worldview prevailing in the East. And we've got, of course, overlaying those, we've got other complexities like guilt, innocence in the West, and we've got power, fear in Africa as a worldview, and we've got honor, shame in the Middle East and in the East. How do these play out practically in multicultural environments? How do you see them playing out in environments that you might have been involved in, and how can we learn from that?
The mistake we many times make is we judge what we don't understand. And so, and it's not just judging, it's value judgments. And I think, that really doesn't enhance what we want to build. And that's why I said earlier on that, people are not problems to be solved. But you mentioned that as well. There needs to be in our heart that curiosity of, what are those different layers? Where are people from? What are their worldviews? Instead of just making those value judgments. Sometimes, like we were living in Kenya and we didn't have any water. So we could only have water twice a week. And that's when we could take a shower. But drinking water, we could, have that every single day. And a colleague, a friend of mine, she's American from the South, and she was very careful about how we use the drinking water. And after several weeks, one morning, she saw a lady, African lady, and she just poured, she just opened the tap, the water was running, and she just came and she said, "Do you know what you're doing? We all know how scarce the water is." And she just went off. And the lady, African lady, responded. She said, "I had no idea. I only arrived last night." Oh, wow. And so she wasn't part of the orientation. Incredible. But again, there was this, just from that worldview, of I need to bring correction, this whole judgment.
Guilt, innocence,
and
judgment.
The guilt conscience. And I don't blame my American friend, but then again, she's even using that as part of her teaching now. But it was like asking questions. It's a whole thing of exploration, the curiosity. And so I think for me, that is very important. Now, there's another element that I want to also bring for us as leaders. Know your sheep. Know your people. Now, what I've seen is that, especially from leaders from the West, individualistic cultures, they're very high on initiative. And many times we equate leadership with initiative. Now, if you are in the Pacific Islands and you take initiative, or if you are from my village and you take initiative, that is the worst thing that you can do, especially depending on the rank of the family, depending on your age. You don't take initiative. You need to be given permission to do things. You need to be invited. And so we sometimes can confuse leadership in our own culture as this is leadership, like initiative. Whereas in other cultures, they will not take initiative, but it doesn't mean they're not leaders. They just need to be given permission. They need to be invited. And we even see that on a global scale, that you've got the most incredible leaders, but they won't say anything unless they're asked to say something. Right. In other cultures, just by raising your hand, you get a point, even if you give the wrong answer.
Yeah.
In other cultures, by speaking out of your turn, that's actually it's actually very very bad. Yeah. And so I think those are the dynamics that you have to learn where people are from. Otherwise, I will never get the best out of my leadership. But if I know my Asians, they need to be invited. They need to be given permission. And then, for my Americans, sometimes, or Europeans, just to say, I think you've already had your turn to speak. Shut up, in a very nice way. And you will only speak when everybody else had a turn to speak around this table. Yeah. And I think what happens, your leadership expand as well. And of course, I'm telling my Africans and Asians that if you're going to wait to be given a turn to speak, you will never be able to say something.
Now, you've spent some time in South America and the Philippines, typical warm climate cultures, and you've spent some time in Switzerland. How does that help us when we think about those personality types that come out of those climates?
I'm married to a Swiss who was born in New York, and I remember when I went to Switzerland. For people to ask you, would you like something to eat? From where I'm coming from, Neil, it's very rude to say yes. You have to wait for them to give you the second or the third invitation, and then reluctantly, you would give in. Yeah. Now, I went hungry in Switzerland that first day or two until my wife asked, "What's going on with you?" I learned very quickly. I think when it comes to your stomach, you learn very quickly. Yeah. She's like, "What's going on with you?" And I said to her, "But it's very rude, to be able to, just say that you're hungry, at the first request." I think they again is that whole, direct and indirect communication. From cold climate cultures, it's like time is money. Yeah. So I'm only going to ask you once. Whereas for us, it's about the narrative, it's about the story, it's about the dance. Yes. And so, you need to understand the dance. And so, cold climate culture, people, they've got one step. Warm climate culture people, they've got 20 steps. And so, exactly. And so that's where you really can miss each other. Yeah. And I think it's really getting, into each other's world. Just in my own relationship, I could never understand how my wife, while living in South Africa, her mom would call from Switzerland, just as we sat down for dinner. And I would pick up the phone and ask her to come to the phone because her mom is having this long distance call from Switzerland to talk to her. And she would tell me, "Please tell my mom she must call back later." Yeah. For a warm cultured African, where honor and respect for the elders is such a high value, I just didn't know what to say. And I remember I was in Switzerland and I told that to her mom in a very apologetic way and said, "I'm so sorry for how rude your daughter is. We would not want to take your call. When you really make the effort to call a long distance." She burst out laughing. She said, "I never felt offended because, sitting at dinner is a very high value." Yeah. And so then I realized I've carried offense in my heart towards my wife's rudeness and dishonor for such a long time, and it wasn't needed. But this is just some of the, cultural clashes.
Yeah, so interesting.
And now we laugh about it, but, that created some real tension, just because we didn't understand, what those values are when it comes to warm climate cultures and cold climate cultures, being direct and indirect, honor, and how we communicate within those frameworks.
Give us some tips on leadership. I mean, maybe you could share with us what are the greatest leadership tips that you've got in this environment. Perhaps a little bit on books. If I want to grow in my cultural understanding, talk to leaders a little bit about that.
I've had a mentor in my life, and it's so interesting. He actually, he's German, and very German, and he did his thesis on how Jesus trained the 12. So he took me on as the guinea pig to see if what he learned, and did his PhD on really worked. So but I think what I've learned, even in the model of the Lord Jesus is the importance there. He was very much embedded in the Middle Eastern, Palestinian, Israeli culture.
Yeah.
And he was really using those idioms that they could understand, those things that we think this was Jesus. No, it was not Jesus. It was the culture of the day. So
Okay.
I think for us working cross-culturally as leaders, Neil, is we need to understand what are the cultural idioms that is embedded within those particular culture when it comes to leadership selection and leadership training. Also understand the power dynamic. We always have a joke about giving each other PowerPoints.
Yes.
It's done from research of a YWAM who, worked for many years in Israel. And he basically says, just by being Western, I mean, that's a PowerPoint, especially when you work in leadership or the church or missions. When you're male, that's a PowerPoint. When you have got access to money, when you can travel, even when you're tall. Yeah. Now, can you imagine that even if you, have that kind of PowerPoint, but you're sitting around the table with a Kenyan who is your senior, they've got more experience than you, decades more experience than you, but you are like this young, upcoming 25-year, Westerner. I can tell you carry the power because you will open your mouth, you will give your opinion, sometimes with a bad attitude, that's fine. But, the power dynamics is not necessarily, who's got the title, who's got the position, but what are those power points that really just, creates those dynamics. And so if you're aware as a Westerner or coming from that particular culture of your PowerPoints, I think that will really help toning, it will help, tempering, even what you will do. Maybe sometimes you will just not say anything.
Yeah.
And it will be awkward.
The aim is not to gain PowerPoints, but to release your PowerPoints, to unpack your PowerPoints so you can come in on the same level, right?
Exactly. So what I'm saying is you have to go to the cross. And when you go to the cross, there's the resurrection. And I think it's for me that cycle of the cross and the resurrection. That's why I'm speaking about the resurrection with my leaders from Kailicha. But I'm speaking about the cross with my leaders from the United States.
I understand.
But then when my leaders from Kailicha start to lead, I start telling them it's time to go to the cross. Oh. So it's being really aware of those things, Neil, as a leader, that I think that is just so important, especially when we want to multiply and we want to release leaders. Servant leadership, it translates across culture. Maybe for the Basotho leader from Lesotho, the idiom, a good prince lights the fire for its people. It may translate differently to maybe a Swiss. Maybe for the Swiss, a good leader, makes the fondue, whatever that idiom means. But servant leadership, that's important. I think indigenous leadership is very key. If we can really lead authentically, leadership is synonymous by being yourself, by being comfortable about who you are, your history, where you're coming from. So that indigeneity is critical. And then I think for me, spiritual leadership, that holds the tension between indigeneity and, and really being a successful leader that is beyond the bubble of your culture. That's where spiritual leadership it transcends then the limitations of my own culture and what I'm comfortable with, particularly leading in an international context.
Edwin Fillis, what a legend. Thank you so much for your time.
It was a privilege to be with you. God bless.
Three process items from our podcast with Edwin Fillies. Firstly, discuss PowerPoints and humility. Do you as leaders carry too many PowerPoints that hold you back from authentic humility? Secondly, discuss the idea that Edwin gave us that people of different cultures are mysteries to be explored. Thirdly, what are your team's pervasive worldviews? We spoke about collectivistic, individualistic, and all the other different worldviews. And how can you as a team create room for diversity within that?
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Elevate, brought to you by the Mergon Foundation. We trust you found this conversation valuable and hope you will join us for more on the topic of leadership and organizational health.